Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Translating Basic Research on the Aging Family to Caregiving Intervention, hosted by the Gerontological Society of America and supported by the GSA Innovation Fund. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the GSA website. A notice to all attendees will be distributed once the recording is available. A question and answer session will immediately follow the presentations. We will be accepting questions through the questions feature accessible on the GoToWebinar panel. I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Laura P. Sands is Editor-in-Chief of Innovation and Aging and Professor of the Center for Gerontology at Virginia Tech. Stephen M. Albert is Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Innovation and Aging and Professor and Chair of Behavioral and Community Health Services at University of Pittsburgh. And I will pass the baton over to Laura now to introduce our guest speaker, Megan Gilligan. Laura?
Yeah, thank you, Judy. And we are delighted to have Megan Gilligan presenting today. She became an assistant professor of human development and family studies at Iowa State in 2013. And she's also a faculty associate of the Gerontology program at Iowa State. She's a rising star as evidenced by 2 awards, the 2017 recipient of the Early Achievement Award in the College of Human Sciences at Iowa State. And in 2016, she was recipient of the National Council on Family Relations regarding Issues and Aging Professional Award. Her work regularly appears in Innovation and Aging, Journal of Gerontology, Social Sciences, and The Gerontologist. And we're very delighted that she's coming to speak about translational significance, a focus of innovation and aging. The reason why we focus on translational significance is really to promote the application of research and the process of knowledge translation to ensure that high quality knowledge is used in the process of decision making. So we are delighted that Megan's here, and we're looking forward to hearing what she has to say today.
Great. This is Steve Albert talking. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Judy. We're going to hear some interesting research Megan has been doing in the area of family dynamics and caregiving. We thought it might be helpful to have a little background. We have some wonderful sources and they keep coming. So we have a pretty good understanding, I think, of the dimensions of caregiving in the United States. A very important survey from the National Alliance on Caregiving in combination with AARP tried to get the prevalence of caregiving in the United States. Let me just give you the question they asked in their large survey. It was a national probability sample. They asked, in the last 12 months, has anyone in your household provided unpaid care to a relative or friend 50 years or older to help them take care of themselves? Unpaid care may include help with personal needs or household chores. It might be managing a person's finances, arranging outside services, or visiting regularly to see how they are doing. The person need not live with you. Well, that's the net they cast to identify caregivers, and there's a lot in that particular question, and we could unpack it if we had a little more time. But I just want to tell you, using that as their STEM question, they identified about 34 million people in the United States, age 18 plus, providing care to someone age 50 plus. And that's about 20% of the US population. It varied a little bit across race ethnicities, between about 17% among whites and up to about 21% among African Americans and Hispanics. So it really is a major, I would say, public health issue in the United States. We know also from a newer poll conducted by NORC in Chicago in combination with the SCAN Foundation that the number of caregivers age 18 to 39 is increasing. So that seems to be a trend developing now, which we may want to consider as we go into caregiving. And finally, we know from the battle standard of all health research and aging, the National Health and Aging Trends and their supplementary national study on caregiving, that about 45% of these caregivers are doing heavy-duty caregiving, that is substantial help. And that applies to help with personal assistance, but also for medical needs, including arranging medical care appointments and handling medications. So it is certainly a big deal and a fundamental component of gerontology. I also want to just throw out one other thing. We live in a field that is always evolving and always changing, and even our language is beginning to change. Is the word caregiver the best word we can use to describe these people? I think a change is slowly taking root now. You're going to see the phrase care partners becoming more popular. And care partner, in my mind, is probably more appropriate because often the older person who's receiving care is a partner in that process. And also, as Megan will tell us, caregiving is not only solitary or singular, there's a shifting and larger cast of characters involved. And likewise, the phrase long-term care is beginning to change. I think we're seeing a move toward a phrase something like long-term living along the same lines. And I'm very proud of my own state, Pennsylvania, which in its Department of Human Services has an Office of Long-Term Living, which used to be the Office of Long-Term Care. So maybe these are two signs that with the change of language, we're having a little more profound understanding of the experience of caregiving. And Megan Gilling will really educate us, I think, a little more about one of the neglected components of this area, and that is the psychosocial interior of the families that provide such care. Megan, if you would.
Great, thank you. I really like that thought of care partners and long-term living, and hopefully those will also be themes that will resonate what I'm going to talk about today in terms of how we might use research on later life families to inform, to translate interventions on caregiving. So I'm going to be talking today about an article that Carl Pilmer and I have, and you can see here on the screen, on translating basic research on the aging family to caregiving intervention. And specifically, I'm going to be using as an example a body of work that Carl Pilmer and Jill Suter and I have been working on the Within Family Differences study. So today, I have kind of three main points that I want to talk to you about. Generally talking about what is translational research. So I'm sure there's many of you joining today who are familiar with this term, but I want to provide some basic understanding for folks who might not be as familiar. I want to talk about the literature on families in later life and why that might be fertile ground for translation. And then I want to end today my discussion talking about what future directions might look like to discuss this idea of how can we pair research on the family with caregiving interventions. So just to start here on the next slide of what is translational research. Again, this is a concept that many of you may be very familiar with, but we also may have different notions of what this means or what this could look like. So on a basic level, if we can agree that translational research involves both the systematic translation of research findings into the development of interventions that are really designed to address real-world problems. And then the reverse of that is that we are moving from interventions in practice back to basic research. So I've included this diagram here to really emphasize that this is a reciprocal process, that we can move from basic research to practice and from practice back to basic research. But although this is the ideal, we don't always approach this when we look at the gerontological literature. We don't always use this model. So we often find actually that there's a distant relationship between fundamental scientific discoveries and what practitioners out in the field are actually doing. So both areas are growing in terms of caregiving, but they're not speaking to each other as well as maybe they could. So I want to start by just giving some introduction first on the next slide here. What do we know in terms of the basic research on family relationships? So if we move to families in later life, we can see on the next slide that there has been this plethora of research over the last several decades, and there has been this interest in individuals who are caring for family members. So Steve gave us a nice overview with research from AARP of how prevalent that is, even thinking about maybe not even caregivers, but care partners. There's this increased interest of what this looks like. And we do know that there are consequences of caregiving for family members in terms of outcomes, in terms of psychological distress, physical illness, and economic strain. And we know that these are especially acute for family members who are caring for an older relative with Alzheimer's disease or related dementia. On the flip side of that, when we look at the practice work, there are a growing number of caregiving interventions. Typically, we see that these programs provide education, counseling. They're providing concrete services based on clinical observations and research about clients' needs. So certain needs assessments, figuring out what do family members need. They're often derived from studies that are focused specifically on caregiver stress and burden. These interventions are empirically based, so they're often tested using different forms of evaluation. So they exist, they're there, they're being implemented, really practical. But one of the things that we noticed as we were going through the literature and looking at reviews of caregiving interventions is that there was really no attempt to use findings from basic research to inspire and design caregiving interventions. So I want to, on the next slide here, go back to that circular design that I had proposed at the beginning. And for today, I really want to focus in on how basic research may inform practice. So I want to focus in on that top half of the circle. And in order to do that, I want to specifically talk about research on families in later life. So I'm going to talk specifically about a body of research on within family differences. So this is work that my colleagues and I have done, as well as other research groups, to look at this idea of how variation exists in later life families. So I just want to give you a little bit of background here on what that looks like in terms of the within family differences literature. So when we think about within family differences, this is a topic that's grounded in classic theories of both social interaction and sociology and psychology. And it acknowledges that relationships between a parent and any of his or her children is likely affected by other relationships in the family. So it's really acknowledging that these multiple relationships exist and they impact one another. This is a topic that had been used by developmental psychologists for a long time to understand families in the early years, so to understand younger family relationships. But over the last several decades, there's really been this growing body of research that's examined within family differences in later life families. So I want to just, on the next slide here, give you some visual of what that means, both in terms of the within family differences literature, but then also what that means for caregiving intervention. So in the within family differences paradigm, there's this acknowledgement that there are older parents and they have adult children and they may have multiple adult children. So likely there are family sizes that are involving multiple children. And previously, when we look at family scholarship, we saw attention of an older parent with one adult child. But the within family differences paradigm encouraged us to think about what do the relationships look like when we take into consideration the other adult children in the family. And I just want to note here as well, if we look at the caregiving intervention literature, we see something very similar to what we had seen in the basic research in terms of often caregiving intervention work is thinking about either the older parent as the care recipient, maybe one adult child as the caregiver, or maybe focusing on one dyad of a care recipient and his or her caregiver. But today I want to think about what if we kind of branch that out and think of it more as a larger family issue. So let me give you here on the next slide just some some information on within family differences in later life, some summaries of the findings, so that we can kind of think about what this might mean for caregiving intervention. So first of all, the growing body of literature on within family differences has shown us that this phenomenon is common and enduring. So it's happening in most families, and it's happening across the life course. So I mentioned that the research has started early in younger families, and it's moved through middle age into later life, and we see that this is kind of a persistent pattern. So there's compelling evidence for parents' favoritism, or what we can refer to as disfavoritism, in terms of relationship quality. So we know that parents often feel a little bit closer to one child than another. They may have more conflict with one child. They evaluate their children differently in terms of feeling pride and disappointment differently between their children. And also there's differences in exchanges of support. And we see this in several research groups, including Karen Fingerman's family exchanges study, that parents may invest or give more to one child, or they may receive more from one child than they do another. So we know that the pattern's there, that it's prevalent, it's long lasting. We also know that it has consequences. In particular, it consistently across the life course, we see that these patterns of within family differences tend to negatively impact sibling relationships. So they increased feelings of conflict and decreased feelings of closeness among siblings, as well as they have detrimental effects on psychological well-being. So that gives us a sense of the findings. Next, I want to talk about how we'll use these findings and how we use these findings, particularly in the paper, to think about, well, what are the implications of this for family caregiving? So how might we translate these basic research findings from this body of literature to caregiving intervention? So today, I want to walk through 4 possible examples of what we thought this could look like. So I want to start with this idea of who cares. So how within family differences might impact caregiving selection. I want to talk about family-based caregiving intervention. So instead of thinking of one individual care recipient or caregiver or even a dyad, thinking of the family as a larger unit. I want to think about how within family differences might impact family therapy. And then last, I want to talk about how within family differences might be used as a sensitizing concept that practitioners and professionals may want to be aware of and use in their practice. So let me start with this first idea of who cares. So within family differences and caregiver selection. So one of the questions that we were interested in our work on the within family differences is how do particular offspring become the primary caregivers while other siblings do not? So this idea of who provides the majority of the care or identifies as a primary caregiver. In the within family differences, each of the mothers was asked to select which of her children would be most likely to care for her on a day-to-day basis if she became ill or disabled. And then we also asked which of the children mothers would prefer to have care for them. And what we noticed is that mothers were most likely to select children on the basis of gender similarity. So mothers were more likely to select daughters. And they were also more likely to select children based on perceived similarity in values. So these were children that really understood them and that they had a higher degree of emotional closeness to these children. So something interesting to note here is that they weren't picking children based necessarily on these very kind of practical factors such as proximity or maybe the occupation the child had. Instead, they were describing these more social emotional characteristics of the children in terms of who they would want to care for them. So I want to, on the next slide here, do some translation. What might that mean? What are the implications of that if we're designing or thinking about programs and interventions in terms of caregiving? Well, first, we realized that mothers expressed clear preferences and expectations for future caregivers. So mothers were aware of these expectations and preferences, and they were able to articulate them. And we also know that these preferences have implications for mothers' well-being. So in work with Carl Pilmer and Jill Suter, we looked at what happened when we asked mothers about these preferences, and then we followed up 7 years later and looked at who they actually got as caregivers, who actually provided care to them. And those mothers who did not receive care from children who they had previously indicated that they preferred care from, they were at elevated risks of detriments to their psychological well-being. They expressed greater depressive symptoms. So not receiving care from a preferred caregiver had implications for the mother's well-being. Taken together, we thought, you know what, this really should have implications for when professionals are working with older parents. They could assess these expectations of the parents as well as those of adult children. So that's one thing I want to note and make clear as we kind of think about this is we also know from our work that parents have these preferences and expectations. Children also have preferences and expectations, but they don't always match with their parents. So it's really important to kind of assess both parties or everyone in the family's preferences and expectations. We argue that these discussions should happen prior to the onset of care needs so that they should happen early. And if we are aware of, or we know as professionals, okay, this is really what an older parent wants, this is what they're expecting, we can work on translation in terms of developing ways in which families can follow an older parent's preferences. So we can implement this information when we're developing care plans. So let me move on to the second example, which is family-based caregiving intervention. So considering the family as a unit. As I mentioned to you earlier, most previous caregiving studies and interventions have focused exclusively either on the primary caregiver or the caregiving dyad. So we often have this care recipient and one caregiver in the family. But actually, we know, and there is a growing body of research showing us that caregiving is actually a quote unquote family affair, that it's negotiated among siblings. So we know that there may be a primary caregiver, but there's also likely to be secondary caregivers, so other adult children who were involved in the process. And even if they are not directly involved in the process or secondary caregivers, other siblings in the family have implications for support and conflict for those adult children who are providing care. We also know that parents' relationships with other children have implications for the overall caregiving experience. So how they interact with not just the primary caregiver, but all the other children in the family has implications for how successful or challenges for the caregiving. So let me give you some examples of what this could look like in terms of translation. We were discussing in the article about how professionals who work with older adults should consider the larger family unit beyond the primary caregiver, because we know that these parents' relationships with other children have implications for the overall caregiving experience. So one of the things that clinicians could be aware of is the differing demands of older adult offspring. So for example, perhaps there are certain adult children in the family who parents are still providing support to. So we know this in our own work, parents may be receiving support, whether it be financial, instrumental, emotional, from some children, while they're simultaneously providing those types of support to another child. And so when we understand these differential support patterns among adult children, we can maybe make better assessments and decisions about how parents' resources can best be allocated. So that this discussion is not just in terms of the parents' needs, but also the adult children's needs. The third example I want to discuss is this idea of how we might use within family differences in family therapy. So first, I just want to note that family therapy approaches are growing for caregivers. There is an emphasis on developing family therapy techniques for later life families in general. and thinking about this specifically in the context of when older family members may need care. And one of the things about family therapy is that family therapists are often already trained to see the family as a quote unquote emotional unit. So often family therapists are coming from a family systems perspective, and they're trained to see the family as a whole. So when we know from our findings is that within family differences appear to intensify the consequences of caregiving. So those negative effects that we talked about earlier, they seem to be exacerbated when within family differences are present. So we know that parents' relationships with other children also have implications for the overall caregiving experience, as I mentioned. So let me go through on the next slide here and just give you some implications for translation that this might have specifically for family therapists. Well, first, therapists could actually systematically assess the long-standing patterns of parental preferences and differential treatment. So these are questions that assessment tools could be designed to ask in the context of a therapy session. Specifically, therapists could incorporate questions that provide parents and, again, adult children with an opportunity to describe the perceptions of parental differential treatment. Also, if therapists are aware of the detrimental consequences that within family differences have, they may be more equipped to discuss this with their clients in terms of acknowledging that this is a common pattern, this happens in a lot of families, and your reaction to parental differential treatment is not unique. A lot of other people have experienced these negative consequences. So providing a space in which families could discuss this in a therapy setting. The last example I want to provide is this idea of using within family differences as a sensitizing concepts. So in general, we can think of Bloomer's idea of sensitizing concepts, that they provide a general frame of reference, so kind of a way of thinking that kind of direct us towards lines of inquiry. So they provide guidance in approaching a particular phenomenon. And we thought that perhaps within family differences could serve as a quote unquote sensitizing concept for professionals and practitioners who are working with later life families. So let me give you a few examples of what that can mean for translation implications. When we think about what it looked like when folks started to assess within family differences in the research context, we imagine that clinicians may have a very similar experience. So for example, if a clinician or a professional asks an older parent, you know, how do you get along with your children? They're likely to get responses that say things like, well, I get along with all my children, or you know what, they're all good kids. Very similar to in the Within Family Differences study, when parents were asked, how do you get along with your kids? There may be responses that came out, and they did, well, you know, I love all my kids. And maybe there would just be a pause or a moment, but I'm really close to Joan. So it didn't even really take a probe, maybe just a pause, and parents would start to express these preferences. Similarly, clinicians could be trained to give that moment of pause or to ask these additional questions so that we can assess these preferences and expectations. And in that sense, within family differences as a sensitizing concept would allow practitioners and professionals to have these dialogues with parents about their relationships with each of their individual children. So I want to just kind of give you then kind of the brief overview. I think there are other implications. Again, we're just focusing on one body of research on within family differences, but within this body of literature, there are at least these 4 examples that we could think of that could really inform interventions to improve the intergenerational caregiving experience. Certainly, we could move into other bodies of literature as well on the family to think about, well, how can we use this basic research to inform specifically caregiving interventions? And I want to follow up here and end today with what does this mean? So if we were to take these basic bodies of literature and move them into caregiving interventions, on the next few slides here, I just have some things that we should consider in terms of our future directions. First, I want to talk about the idea of evaluation. So if we were to use a within family differences perspective and move it into caregiving, this would have implications for how we would evaluate these types of programs and intervention. So first of all, let me say that evidence for the current evaluations of caregiving is pretty mixed. So there have been several meta-analyses on current caregiving evaluations. We know that a very few number of studies have actually moved into randomized control trials. So there's already a need to maybe try to employ more rigorous evaluation designs. And often we're working with smaller sample sizes when we try to implement these types of programs and interventions in the community. So we have issues to address in terms of statistical power. These are similar concerns we would have if we moved into these kind of family-based interventions I'm proposing today. Some positives or techniques or methods that evaluators could take advantage of, however, are that there are statistical techniques now that have become quite sophisticated with multi-level modeling. So we could assess the outcomes of multiple family members. So versus previous interventions, which may have focused on the outcomes of the care recipient or one adult child, we could start to look at variations. So how does the intervention impact one adult child versus another adult child in the family? So definitely using multi-level model techniques would be a plus. The other advantage of methodology that we have is we've developed ways to collect qualitative data from multiple family members, so from parents and adult children. And by doing this, we can also capture multiple family members' perspectives and experiences. As I mentioned to you earlier in the Within Family Differences study, we realize that not everyone is always on the same page. When we ask multiple family members about their expectations, preferences for care, or even just how the caregiving experiences are going, we often get very different stories. And so using qualitative data collection from multiple family members would allow us to get a more holistic perspective when we evaluate these types of family-based interventions and programs. I also want to just broadly talk about here just what this would mean in terms of researcher-practitioner collaboration. So first of all, I just want to note that this isn't something that one person or one group has to do by themselves, but this could really provide the opportunity for really interesting collaborations between basic researchers as well as practitioners. So things to keep in mind as we're building these collaborations to build these programs and interventions is practitioners are the eventual kind of end users of the research. So practitioners should be engaged as partners in establishing research priorities. So today I kind of focused on how we might move research to practice, but ideally we would also involve practice when we're setting research agendas. There are current methods that are available to facilitate research practitioner collaborations. I note a few here. Community-based participatory research is becoming widely used, as well as consensus building methods. So there's not necessarily a need to quote unquote reinvent the wheel, but we can start using some of these methodologies to build the collaboration. Overall, the idea here is that we can really create a better marriage of science and service that allows us to develop creative and effective intervention designs that can be used in the context of gerontology and life course. And today, specifically thinking about how this might improve caregiving interventions for families taking care of older adults. So I will stop there for now and pass the baton off.
Okay. We're going to have time for questions, but I'd like to turn it over back to Dr. Sands a little bit just to talk for a minute about innovation in aging.
Thank you, Steve. So one of the features of innovation in aging is that it's a very much of an interdisciplinary journal in which people from different disciplines come together to study a topic that's relevant to aging in the life course. And so we heard today in Megan's presentation the importance of not just social scientists coming to the forefront to describe these within family differences and how it impacts care partnership within a family. But we also heard that Megan talking about the translational significance is really to bring in people who are providers, professional providers of both primary care and long-term care. And I think that what she's done there is give a wonderful, easily understood example of some of the fundamental elements of knowledge translation. So what she did is she synthesized the literature, she gave context to the research findings that are available on this topic, and she disseminated this not just through the article that she published, but also through this webinar, and giving real concrete examples in this webinar about how this information can be disseminated out to the provider community. And then she talked about how would she work with providers in implementing this knowledge. And that's what we're really trying to do at Innovation in Aging, is get people to think about the practical significance of their work. So in Innovation in Aging, you'll see a blue box that appears just under the abstract. And in that blue box is the translational significance of the study. And that is the practical application of this study to persons who care for or persons who are going through the aging process. And so I want you to consider that as you think about a journal to publish in. You don't want to just publish your paper and put it on your Vita. You want to publish a paper and make sure that that knowledge that you've generated as articulated in your paper has maximal translational impact. So I thank you for listening, and I'll pass it back.
Okay. Thanks, Laura. All right, so now we'd like to open the session up for questions. You'll see there's a chat bot or chat room on the side there. Please type your questions in. Of course, as one of the moderators, I have the pleasure of opening up with questions. And let me throw a few out, but if you have some, please feel free to communicate with us via this great GoToMeeting app, and we'll cover as many as we can. We're doing pretty well on time. So Megan, first question for you. What is the evidence base for these family-based interventions for these care partners? Are there trials out in the field now that you think address the dynamics you've discussed, and is there some emerging evidence for their efficacy?
I think that there is an emerging group of programmers and those designing interventions who are trying to involve multiple family members. And I think it's worth noting that also poses challenges. So the first step of that is actually involving the dyad, so involving an older family member and maybe an adult child caregiver, or we see spousal caregiving interventions. And the more people we involve, it creates some feasibility challenges in terms of keeping them into the program, keeping them attending, and getting information to evaluate. So it's not without its challenges, and I've seen some of that. So the design is there to involve multiple family members, but coming up with approaches to maintain or recruit and retain multiple family members in the actual intervention is definitely something to consider as we move forward.
Okay, great. What about this shift in the composition in the ages of family care partners? I'm going to use that word if I may. We are seeing a trend toward younger care partners. And is there some sense that family-based interventions need to differ because of these age differences in the care partners?
First of all, I think that shift is really interesting, and I definitely think that and I can think of two ways that has implications for intervention. The first is that certainly younger caregivers are likely to have different roles and responsibilities at that point in their lives. So they may be actively engaged in the workforce. They may be caring for younger children themselves. So they have different roles and responsibilities that may make caregiving particularly challenging, or being care partners particularly challenging. So that's something to think about. The second consideration that comes to mind for me is I'm wondering how many of these younger caregivers are actually caring for grandparents.
Right.
So we know demographically that this is one of the first times that we're seeing adult grandchildren who are living at the same time as their grandparents, and that provides kind of a wealth of opportunities for relationship quality and experiences. And perhaps these are adult grandchildren who are engaging as care partners, and so they may have unique needs. Maybe they have had different relationships with their grandparents than we've seen in the past. So I definitely think that's an interesting phenomenon, and kind of ripe for designing unique interventions for that particular population.
Okay, great. Let me throw out one more. I take up maybe a little more expansive definition of family than you did in your presentation. In many cases, perhaps even a 20 to 25% now, these caregiving families have paid help involved. So it's often a joint effort of kinsfolk and also paid help. Sometimes we see a blurring of borders in consumer-directed care where the family member is being paid, although that's still a minority of caregiving situations now. Does that change the equation at all in looking at family dynamics, or how so?
Yeah, I definitely think so. One, perhaps that's a resource that certain families are able to draw on, so to rely on paid help. So maybe that is a resource that can help to relieve some stress, maybe some respite care for family caregivers. But at the same time, I'm thinking in terms of this caregiving being a family affair. That's another aspect that family members may have to negotiate in terms of what are older parents' preferences or expectations, but also what are care partners' expectations in relying on those types of resources. And I know that there are a growing number of caregiving interventions that are asking families to talk about the costs of care. So there are definitely different perspectives on what resources should go to care, what that should look like, what preferences should be. So even just in terms of how to financially negotiate paid resources is additional consideration for families and conversations that families may have.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so I think, Judy, you've sent a link out to folks if they do want to participate with a question or two. Have some questions come in?
Yes. We have one asking about, how do you see this application of perspective with older adult couples and the spouse is the care provider?
Yeah, I'm glad that this question came up. So in our work within Family Differences, we are looking at parents' relationships with adult children, but I'm glad this question came up because we should also note that spouses are likely to kind of be the first caregiver when needs arise. And so similar dynamic in terms of, again, knowing that care recipients have expectations and preferences, and are they having these discussions with spouses as well as adult children. So I really like the term care partner that Steve introduced at the very beginning here, because if we think of it that way, then it maybe encourages these types of conversations that should happen between family members, whether they be spouses and adult children. And I know in the family research, even among spouses, I know there's work on end-of-life decision-making and end-of-life preferences, you might think a spouse, especially if partners have been together for a long time, then they would know, they would know these preferences. Of course they would, but the literature shows us that that's just not always the case. So it's not that spouses are more knowledgeable about this necessarily even than adult children are. It really, when you put the literature together as a whole, it just seems like maybe these are really difficult conversations for families to be having. And so I think that there really are a lot of translational implications in terms of how do we facilitate these conversations again early and often, so that spouses, adult children, whoever the care partners are going to be, they're aware of preferences and expectations well before the needs actually arise.
Mm-hmm. And there are a couple of questions related to the one that you just answered, but I'll share with the full audience. But there is an added element here within the question that we haven't addressed. So I am interested in not only traditional within family caregiving roles, but also blended families where a parent has remarried later in life and there are stepchildren, and what caregiving roles stepchildren may take on, caring for a step-parent. But here's a different dimension here, with dementia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think these are all really kind of interesting things for us to consider. I will say in the cohort of the Within Family Differences study, the parents are now mid to late 80s. So we didn't see the prevalence of blended families in the Within Family, or we don't see the prevalence of blended families in the Within Family Differences study that we're certain to see in younger cohorts. So there's this complexity of families as they're changing that certainly would have to be taken into consideration. And so there's kind of, I mentioned when I was talking that Within Family Differences kind of came from the study of younger families. Right now, I think we kind of have this growing body of research of what implications blended families have in younger families in the early years, and there's kind of a growing body of what does this mean for later life families, and it certainly creates complexity in terms of how even do we kind of define these relationships. So if there are step parents in later life families, does that mean that someone is a parent, and language that we use in terms of parent and spouses. And so I think these types of conversations may become even more important. And as new families form and join, these are maybe discussions and expectations that have to happen early, but then continue to happen because the longevity of these families may be several years or decades, and maybe things shift as family dynamics shift as well, or as care needs. So if someone's experiencing cognitive decline or dementia, that we would have these conversations hopefully before that, so we could know preferences and expectations, but definitely adding another layer of complexity. And it's a growing phenomenon. So we know from Ifan Lin and Susan Brown's work at Bowling Green, there's this increase in the quote unquote gray divorce. Individuals are experiencing marital dissolution later in life, as well as likelihood of experiencing widowhood. So we are likely to see these increased numbers of remarriages, as well as marital dissolutions.
Mm-hmm. This is a nice question, and segueing from your work in Within Family Differences, the question is, so what's next in your world? What's next in your work within family differences?
That's a great question. So thinking about the things we talked about today, so collaborators and I are thinking about actually starting to do some of this translation, so what this might be. So Steve asked me in terms of what do interventions currently look like. I think we're kind of ready to start implementing some of this basic research. So we're discussing of what that might look like in terms of what that might look like for future research designs and involving multiple family members and caregiving interventions. And we're also interested in the Within Family Differences study of what these family dynamics look like as we move even further into the life course. So what does this look like in experiences of bereavement? And then also, what does this look like when we consider parents, adult children, and then also, I mentioned the increased prevalence of adult grandchildren. So considering not just multiple family members in 2 generations, but the recognition that there are likely to be families with 3+ generations alive right now. So considering how these family dynamics happen across generations as we move across the life course.
Great, thank you. We do have a couple of just questions around housekeeping notes, but before I get into those types of answers, I want to also allow a couple of extra minutes for any closing thoughts. I don't want to shift the topic quite yet, but I will just to address some of these questions. But I'll mention just quickly then, a reminder to all that we're recording the session, so we'll send everyone an access link by email once the recording's available. And along with that, everyone will be able to download a copy of the presentation slides from today. And so where you need to go for that will be the geron.org/webinar website for those details. But again, that link will be provided in all follow-up communications. And I also want to mention that a webinar survey will automatically launch after the webinar. So in an effort for continual improvement, we always love to hear your thoughts. So please provide feedback by clicking the survey link at the end of the webinar. So before we do that, are there any closing comments? I really want to thank you, Megan, Laura, Stephen, for bringing a terrific program to GSA. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yes, and I'd like to just add my thanks. And I think, Megan, you've given us a good feel for the complexity of families, and the questions we got show it's even more complex, and there's plenty of work for us to do. All of it, which I think will help the families, and that, of course, is our translational goal in this case.
And this is Laura Sands, and I'd like to remind the audience that Megan's paper, and she published with Carl Pilmer, is in Innovation in Aging. Innovation in Aging is a fully open access journal, so you may not only download the article for free, but you can use it in other contexts as well.
Great. Well, thank you to everyone for participating. Have a wonderful Halloween trick or treat. This is the end of the program.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.